welcome to the AAS 21 podcast. I'm Eddie Glaude, and I'm the chair of the Department of African American Studies here at Princeton University. I'm delighted to have joined me today my dear colleague, Kinohi Nishikawa. Professor Nishikawa specializes in African American literature and modern print culture. His work has been supported by the Woodrow Wilson National Fellowship Foundation, the U.S. Department of Education, and the National Endowment for the Humanities. And we're delighted to have his first book, Street Players, Black Pulp Fiction and the Making of a Literary Underground, due out in November of 2018 with the University of Chicago Press. Street Players takes us to the center of Black Pulp Fiction within the Los Angeles publishing Holloway House. And from the late 1960s until it closed in 2008, the Holloway House specialized in cheap paperback books like Iceberg Slim's Pimp and Donald Goines' Daddy Cool. Street Players explores how this world of black pulp fiction was produced, received, and recreated over time and across different communities of readers. It's an amazing read. He's also working on a major project, I believe tentatively titled Blueprints for Black Writing, African American Literature and Book Design, which considers the important yet often overlooked role book design, from typography to paper quality to cover art. This important role is played in shaping modern African American literature. Professor Nishikawa's essays and articles elaborate on all of this with specific case studies of Black book and periodic history, and his article, The Archive of Its Own, Black Politics, Independent Publishing, and the Negotiations, won the Catherine Newman Best Essay Award from the Society for the Study of the Multi-Ethnic Literature of the United States. Welcome, Brother Kinohi. How you doing?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me, Eddie.
Man, I hope I got all of that right.
You did.
So let's just jump into this. I mean, because I'm really fascinated by the particular nature of your interest and how you locate that interest in the specific work you do. So talk a little bit about how you came to have an interest in the history of the book and print culture as such, and particularly African American print culture.
That's a great question, Eddie. You know, I'm a first-generation college student, so I don't take so-called book learning for granted, as it were. You know, I grew up reading comic books, pulp, Stephen King, things of that nature, and transitioning into reading for a grade or reading to write papers was a big thing for me. And taking notice of the different cultures of the book that I had both grown up with and learned how to inhabit and learn how to negotiate in college really exposed me to thinking about the ways in which the production of texts is not neutral. The literature that we are given has to be sort of funneled through a complex historical process of winnowing and selection and then dissemination. And so early on in college, I knew that I was interested in asking meta questions about the literature that was given to me. Not simply, what does this text mean, but how it came to me, how it was produced, how it was selected, and in what form was I consuming it in the dorm room or in the classroom. And so that early interest, which really came from my own sort of unfamiliarity with reading for school or reading at a higher level than simply for entertainment, then fed into my graduate studies, where I happened to study with a great faculty in Duke University's program in literature that was asking precisely these questions, not just with African American literature, but really with literature writ large. The program in literature has a strong sort of Marxist tradition, from Jameson to younger scholars. And I also happened to study with major cultural studies scholars such as Wanima Lubiano, Janice Radway, who helped me understand how I could ask these questions of a particular literary tradition, namely African American literature, and focus my attention on books published in that tradition.
So this journey to the book has everything to do with your own unique formation, first gen, So am I in interesting sorts of ways. And the kind of residual trace of that initial step, right, kind of impacts your gait. How does it inform, because this question may sound a bit weird or I don't want to make, the genetic fallacy here, but how does it inform the way in which you navigate the archive? Your choice of literatures, because you said, the kinds of books you were reading before you embarked on your college career. And you have a fascination with pulp fiction, black pulp fiction. And I tend to see that connection. So talk a little bit about, right, the way in which you approach the archive and why you decided to choose to work with this genre of writing as opposed to quote unquote high literature, as it were.
That's a great question. And given where I came from, I knew that there was a way of taking seriously sort of lower forms of literature, such as pulp, crime fiction, romance fiction, in the college classroom. And I knew that going into graduate study, such that the very first course that I taught at this level was titled Black Popular Fiction. I had already known I wanted to do some version of book history and print culture studies, remember, from undergrad. Mm-hmm. And Wanima and Jan really sort of helped prepare me to enter into the classroom to really think about the black literary tradition, not from your standard bearers or from your canonical figures, but from below, as it were. And so the first course I taught was titled Black Popular Fiction. And there I really tried to do a broad survey of African-American literature from the ground up, from Chester Himes through Alice Walker and Terry McMillan, all the way up to Elin Harris, with pit stops in Black Pulp Fiction along the way, right. Iceberg Slim and Donald Goines. And what I discovered is that teaching it from this angle really still got us into asking questions that are important to the study of literature in general.
Like what? Like how so?
Not just how do texts mean, but particularly for the African-American literary tradition, how's an author like Chester Himes thinking about urban housing, thinking about residential segregation, thinking about police brutality, not necessarily in highbrow literature, but in his crime series with Coffin Ed Johnson and Gravedigger Jones. We read Cotton Comes to Harlem, which is also, by the way, a meditation on the Back to Africa scheme of the UNIA. So even in a popular form, we could still talk about big questions that we're used to sort of locating in higher forms of literature.
So let me press a little bit more. So you can do this work that is typically associated with reading high literature, quote unquote. It could be done in a genre like pulp fiction. So you can ask the same questions in these different domains, but what does it mean to choose one domain over the other, right? It could very well be the case that you're just interested in the question and you happen to ask it in place A as opposed to place B, but there seems to be a politics, or not necessarily a politics, a set of normative commitments that bring one site interview as opposed to another. Now, I've already kind of hinted at the kind of biographical part, right? This is the stuff that you grew up reading, the stuff that was kind of close to you. But why ask the questions with this literature as opposed to the traditional stuff?
The fact that I started asking these questions in the classroom is not incidental to this, because it was only by showing students that what they were reading on their downtime could in fact be taken seriously and sort of mined for what they had to say about these bigger questions. It was by doing that I got to see how, in some ways, all types of reading involve a certain kind of thinking. Mm-hmm. But because of the way the culture industry and forms of symbolic capital are set up, we're taught by institutions to value only certain kinds of reading over others. right? And as a first-generation college student, I grew up reading literature that you weren't supposed to take seriously. That's not inherent to the literature. It's how institutions have defined it. But when I taught a course on leisure reading, essentially, and showed students the amazing work that these books were doing in their own right, it almost opened a window to them into literature writ large. They said, if I can read Himes and Terry McMillan and Elin Harrison this way, by God, can't I take those same strategies of reading and apply it to Invisible Man, and apply it to Toni Morrison, and apply it to so-called higher forms of literature that happen to be tackling the same questions? For many of my students, recognizing that Elin Harris's Invisible Life is a direct rescripting of Invisible Man, but set in a sort of gay romance genre, was revelatory, right? Because it actually spurred them to read Invisible Man by way of gay romance
fiction. So do you have
fiction.
to disabuse people like me of the kind of assumption that the writing isn't as elegant, that craft is kind of compromised, that it's not as technically robust, that the depth of thinking, So how do you convince, because, sometimes I could be a snob when it comes to these things, you said it could be an entry into literature, broader literatures at the level of craft, technique, and the like. So how do you manage, moving from Sapphire to Toni Morrison or something like that?
I totally take that point. And I have to be honest with you, Eddie, when I first read Waiting to Exhale in undergrad, my instinct was to sort of push back against it. I really didn't like it at first. And I read it my senior year, and what's interesting is that by then I had already come to appreciate. Remember, I was a first gen, but over 3 years I had come to appreciate what canonical literature could sort of give me as a student. And when I encountered Terry McMillan my senior year, I was already pushing back on it in a way that I perhaps wouldn't have when I was a bit younger. But what I came to realize in graduate school is my pushback had to do with not recognizing McMillan's genre codes.
Oh, okay.
I couldn't appreciate romance fiction.
Read it for what it is.
Read it for what it is.
Oh, okay.
The quality of the writing often isn't as good. But in some ways, asking that question of these books is exactly the wrong thing to do. These books are working within genres. And in fact, it's popular fiction that sheds light on the question of genre in ways that can illuminate the literary field writ large, in my experience.
Say more about that. That's fascinating. How so?
To write good popular fiction, you almost have to have mastered the codes of genre in a way that even, avant-garde artists would struggle to do. Mm-hmm. It's a form of writing that's so attuned to formula, to the different benchmarks you need to hit in order to produce a certain effect, emotional or otherwise, that there's actually an art to that. There is a craft to that is not reducible to quality of writing, but is much more about recognizing the codes and how well these authors meet them. Okay. This is what made Chester Himes such a masterful writer of crime fiction, right? And McMillan and Harris, wonderful writers of romance fiction. Because as much as they were writing about big questions relating to African American life, they did so in a way that was so attuned to genre codes that readers, everyday readers, could pick up on them because they knew the steps that they had to be taking, satisfying conclusion to a mystery or a resolution of a romantic conflict. They knew those things had to be taken up and resolved in a way that was satisfying on the level of genre.
That's really helpful. One last question about method and approach. You mentioned Jameson and Juanima Lubiano. When I read your work, I see what could be described, and I think given your intellectual lineage, rightly described as a kind of materialist approach, but it's not reducible to that. So say a little bit about, how you come to these texts, and what's your way of reading them. I mean, we're getting something, but I want to hear more explicitly how you situate yourself within this school of thought out of which you come, if that makes sense.
It does make sense. And what the graduate program in literature, and in particular Professor Lubiano and Professor Radway taught me to do was to not take for granted the status of literature itself as this universal, timeless category that we come to and study and learn to sort of pick apart, but more or less leave intact. In some ways, my education at Duke was about questioning what defines literature as such. Jan, at the time, had just come off from doing a wonderful book on the Book of the Month Club and middlebrow aesthetics. Juanima, for her entire career, has sort of moved between genres and registers to think about the ways in which Black politics, Black social life are encoded in everything from Spike Lee to Toni Morrison. So these were models for me in thinking about the African-American literary tradition, not as something that we can only encounter through anthologies, but as something we encounter as a living, dynamic tradition that has been produced by many hands and that has been targeted to a wide range of readers, not all of them African-American. And that's an important part of the story that I tell in my scholarship. But that nonetheless gives a broader shape and a more expansive imagination to African-American literature than if we just simply encountered it as disembodied text on the page. The process of making it, disseminating it, and readers taking it up and doing what they will with it, that's a dynamic story that my materialist approach to the literature always tries to get at.
Yeah, it offers an interesting kind of response to Kenneth Warren's What is African-American Literature, right? I mean, it seems to me that you would have an answer to that question in a way that would push him a bit. Am I wrong?
You're not wrong. To the extent that African-American literature is constantly being made and remade, it continues to exist.
Exactly.
The definition of it is not imminent to disembodied text.
Right.
It's about the making of it and the remaking of it for different audiences over time.
So, I mean, this is a beautiful transition to Street Players. It's a gorgeous book.
Thank you. I love the design.
I love the design. I mean, you could tell that you demanded a kind of attentiveness to this in some way. Now, this is a social history. Talk a bit about what drew you to the Holloway House and these two white men who are fascinating characters in this story. Talk a little bit about that.
I'd be glad to. Street Players is, as you say, a social history. And it's a social history of blaxploitation before it was ever called that, and long after the movies known as blaxploitation finished its cycle. I was drawn to Holloway House precisely through this teaching experience I related to you. I first taught Iceberg Slim and Donald Goines in that class, and their novels that I taught by far elicited the most impassioned, shall we say, responses out of all the books we studied that semester. Again, which ran from Himes to Elin Harris. And I knew there was something there about the way my students responded to these two books that, first of all, most people weren't even aware of, in the sense that these books had an underground circulation that many academics, much less ordinary readers, wouldn't have known of. But that the quality of their passion in responding to these texts also showed me that there was something about Black social life that these books were speaking to, capturing, responding to, that merited a sort of story or history in its own right. So that course led me to thinking about, well, where do these books come from? And who was this independent publisher based out in Los Angeles that not only produced these individual novels, but produced hundreds of titles over over a handful of decades that could broadly be defined under the label Black Pulp Fiction. And what did it mean? How did it matter that it had a monopoly over Black Pulp Fiction?
So this was the house that
this
was
was the house.
Wow.
This was the house. And that's why I made the link to blaxploitation. Because the house, which was owned by two white men, Bentley Morris and Ralph Weinstock, had a commercial interest in Black Pulp Fiction that cannot be divorced from the way the books were taken up by African-American readers in the 70s and 80s.
So what is Morris and Weinstock cashing in on? Right? I mean, the arc of the book is really fascinating, right? There's a sense in which they have a monopoly on publishing these books, and they're trading on all sorts of prurient kind of views of race and sex, and in some ways inhabiting stereotypes, white stereotypes of black life, of black men, of the black, gangster, of the black criminal, however we want to describe. So talk about this evolution from that initial moment to where you end up in the book, where it's not quite that. It's something radically different. Tell that story.
They did indeed start publishing Iceberg Slim for reasons that emphasized the prurience of the story he had to tell about his pimping life in Chicago.
Yeah.
And part of the story I tell in Street Players is what their commercial investment in that prurience was in 1967. It's a story that, for all the folks who have written on Black Pulp Fiction, it's a story that they have been cautious about telling, in part because it challenges our sense of how an authentic black popular culture can arise and where it might originate from. Over time, particularly in the 1970s, and with the rise of the second author I mentioned, Donald Goines, who amazingly published 16 titles in a matter of 4 years, it's only with his rise that we begin to see Black Pulp Fiction, as it's produced by Holloway House, turning toward an African-American audience and really marketing the fiction toward black readers, because it did not start off that way, right? Hence the commercial investment in prurience. And in some ways, the story of the genre from there on out is the story of how African-American readers, who are also African-American authors, begin to take ownership of the genre in ways that exceed what Morris and Weinstock can imagine for it. Such that by the 1980s, we're seeing folks like Tracy Marrow, many people might know him today as Ice-T, actually reading Iceberg Slim, rereading him, and creating art and a whole nother kind of artistic persona out of that experience of reading Pimp,
Right.
and transforming it into rap.
Right.
But it's only when black readers become black authors, become black artists, and sort of own that literature for themselves that we begin to see a sort of breakaway from Morris and Weinstock's influence.
So
on
there's
Black Pulp
so
Fiction.
you trace the arc of this kind of how would one describe this resignification, this reappropriation of Black Pulp Fiction for ends that take us in a different direction. But it's fascinating to me that Morris and Weinstock would take off in 66, right? Am I right in that periodization? 67, 66?
1967.
1967. I mean, from 67 to 80, that's an interesting period. And this is the height of Black power, right? So what is the relationship between? And let me say it. Let me ask it differently. We know that one of the features of Black power is a turn to, right, a certain representation of the black community, right? In some ways, it's a rebellion against certain middle class norms, certain ideas of respectability. It's like trying to account for Richard Pryor's humor, right? We're going to find art in the saucy language of everyday life, right? What does it mean for Morris and Weinstock to take off in that initial phase during this period?
It's a really odd convergence.
Yeah.
And one of the sort of scenes of the book lands on Larry Neal's response to Iceberg Slim, which is very harsh.
Yes, of course it would be. Right.
And in his poem Brother Pimp, which is dedicated to Slim, he has harsh words for someone who would exploit his community for profit.
And Larry Neal, of course, is Black Arts Movement, one of its central theorists, as it were, right?
One of its central theorists.
Right.
The same volume in which that poem appears, Amiri Baraka writes the introduction.
Fascinating.
And even though he doesn't name Slim explicitly, the way in which he's sort of approving Brother Pimp suggests that he's in full agreement with Larry Neal. So in some ways, ideologically, Black Pulp Fiction is the complete opposite of Black Power. But the reason why it takes off is that on a deeper level, okay, beyond the sort of textual discourse, the pleasures of narrative, the pleasures of genre, the pleasures of seeing Black heroes and anti-heroes in crime fiction, espionage fiction, gang fiction, these things actually do tap into the culture in ways that ideology alone can't capture. So at the same time that Black Pulp Fiction has a very vexed relationship to Black power and cultural nationalism, at the level of the pleasures it affords, it's in fact being taken up by millions of readers.
So what do you think about it at the level of the representation of the masculine? Do they converge at that point? Because we know there's a kind of hyper-masculinity that defines Black power in so many ways, right? And the kind of masculinist dimensions of the pose of the figures in these books. What do you think? Am I reaching here? But how is masculinity, Black masculinity represented? I mean, Iceberg Slim is one example, but how is it being represented in these texts in interesting sorts of ways?
In a word, self-possessed. It is a reclaiming of Black manhood on the level of the pleasures that genre affords that we haven't seen up to that point, and that only in some domains of I would say music, and possibly in latter-day urban fiction, we come to see since. But really, for its time, it reclaims a self-possessed Black masculinity in ways that stand out from everything else that's being produced. It is the anti-Poitiers.
It's the anti-Poitiers.
In a certain way. And
unpack that. What does that mean? Unpack that.
Coming out of 1967, right? So this is, again, it's important to note that this precedes Blaxploitation.
Right.
1967, your coordinates are less Shaft, who won't come onto the scene for another 4 or 5 years, but your coordinates are Poitiers. Right? And your coordinates are a certain civil rights informed, respectable, middle-class Black masculinity that you may see challenged here and there in things like Claude Brown's Man-Child in the Promised Land, Malcolm X's autobiography, but that you don't really see much else besides that. Black Pulp Fiction comes along and reclaims a kind of self-possessed Black masculinity. And here's the key. It does it serially. So it does it over a number of books and not just one. It took them a while. It took Holloway House a while for them to figure this out and how to do this. For a while, it was only Iceberg Slim and a handful of other authors who were publishing with them. But once they saw the popularity among Black readers themselves, they started publishing serial fiction, the adventures of a particular hero or anti-hero over a number of books, so that these fantasies, these reclamations of Black masculinity could be drawn out over time.
So once Holloway House realizes that a Black reading public is actually commercially profitable, we begin to see the shift. So there is the kind of money can be made by these black readers, right? But in terms of the writing itself, I mean, do we see a shift? You talk about Robert Peck telling his story. By the time we get to Donald Goines, do we see him kind of writing with a white gaze in mind, or is the writing still kind of trying to reveal something to a white audience, or has the writing turned towards black folk, not just simply because they buy the books, but because now they can just speak to them without having to worry about certain assumptions by white folks about who and what we are?
One of the key arguments of the book, which has yet to be sort of made by other scholars who study the genre, is that it's in fact Goines's writing that shifts the genre toward a black reading public. That's what indexes it. And what does he do that's different from Slim? He writes according to formula. Slim is writing in a way that's more of a kind of standalone book that's being put out there for the prurient gaze of a largely white reading public. But Goines gives Holloway House a model for how to genuinely write black formula fiction. And it's his books that sort of turn the genre away from that white gaze toward a black reading public that really just wants to have pleasurable formula fiction, like, you know, books that can satisfy certain benchmarks, serially over any number of titles. And he becomes the model for how to write black pulp fiction for a black reading public after the early 1970s.
That's fascinating. So Holloway House closes shop around 2008. Street Players ends by, in some ways, charting the residual traces of that run. How might we kind of identify those traces in our own current moment?
Most explicitly, in urban fiction. The key shift that we see beginning in the 1990s is African American women saying, you know, we do have our Alice Walkers, our Toni Morrisons. Heck, we even have our Terry McMillans. But what we don't have is a female counterpart to black pulp fiction, to Iceberg Slim, to Donald Goines. And so what you see are women like Vicky Stringer, Terry Woods, begin to sort of self-publish their own, what they called urban fiction in the 1990s. And that, of course, birthed a movement of independent, self-published African-American authors, many of them women, producing their own sort of hybrid sort of crime and romance fictions that we now call street fiction, urban fiction, hip-hop literature. And what did that do to Holloway House? It took away a vital part of their niche, their ability to market to a black reading public. So it's no coincidence that when urban fiction really starts to peak in the late 90s and early aughts, Holloway House begins to falter. I mean, of course, there's things like internet sales and competition with other media. But really, the fact that black women made this genre their own and decided not to publish with Holloway House, but to self-publish, really spelled the end of Holloway House's monopoly on the genre. So urban fiction is a really important legacy of this that, in fact, decisively turned the genre away from monopolistic control.
And are there any kind of carryovers in terms of themes, in terms of what does it mean to go from the kind of hyper-masculinist works of Iceberg Slim and even Donald Goines to black women writing urban fiction? What happens at the level of content here?
In my opinion, you see a profound reorientation of perspective. Because even if a lot of the settings look or sound similar sometimes, right? Hip-hop tracks sort of dot a lot of urban fiction. The perspective of coming from a woman, sometimes a gay man, sometimes a lesbian, these fundamentally shift what Holloway House had been marketing, right, since roughly the early 1970s. And it fundamentally moves away from a sort of default position of self-possessed black masculinity. You just don't have that notion of defending that, of reclaiming that as your default anymore. You have perspectives of incarcerated women who have their own issues to deal with in terms of domestic issues, in terms of crime and criminal justice, that are qualitatively distinct from the ways in which Slim and Goins narrate their own experiences of incarceration. And I would argue that it's an improvement on it, precisely because it opens up that perspective away from reclamation and sort of identifying with a singular black character, and more opening it up to a cast of characters. Right, black women in general. It's not a coincidence that some of the classic urban fiction titles involve not just one hero or anti-hero, but a cast.
Right.
2 women, 3 women, or more.
Wow. So, Street Players has been birthed. The second project, how's it coming?
I am actively at work on it, and I'm excited about it.
Yeah.
Because it takes my interest in approaching African American literature through a materialist lens and turns it on something that it's paradoxical. On the one hand, it's the most visible part of the book, its cover, its typeface, and yet also somehow it's most invisible in that we tend to take these things for granted and not comment on them explicitly. And it's asking, what would a history of African American literature look like through the lens of design, through the lens of how books, African American author books, have been designed over roughly a century.
Well, I can't wait for that. As we come to a close, one can't help but note the journey. First gen, reading books that you could put in your back pocket, and here you are now writing about all of that. What can you tell a student who's searching for that subject matter that will animate her practice? What can you tell her about, the kind of advice that you could offer her given your own journey to now?
It's important to me that I link my methods to a history of Black studies scholarship, which would include bibliographers such as Arthur Schomburg, Dorothy Porter Wesley, which would include literary historians with the real eye for book history, such as Charles T. Davis, the first African-American tenure-track faculty member at Princeton, and, of course, Arnold Rampersad. In other words, it's important for me to show how my methods derive from a long genealogy of what might be called Black bibliography. My predecessors took up these methods because they recognized that African-American literature was not seen as a literature in their time, was not seen as a coherent body of work produced by novelists, poets, journalists, over time, right, that deserved the kind of consideration one would give to, say, Shakespeare, Milton, or Eliot. So for them, book history, bibliography, and in Rampersad's case, biography, was a way of legitimating what had long been, first of all, not thought about. And when it was thought about, was dismissed, right, as not as important as canonical literature, the literature we anthologize. So for a student who wants to see herself in this tradition, I would say that these methods, in fact, legitimate what other people might consider subliterary or not worthy of attention. Because the methods are neutral over the question of literary value, right? They're more interested in questions like how these works operate, to whom they're being targeted, and where and why they're being taken up. In short, evaluating literary works on their own terms. And once you learn how to use these materialist methods, which again have a long genealogy that's linked not only to Marxist literary criticism, but to Black studies, I think it can be incredibly liberating to take something you long considered frivolous or something you wouldn't dream of reading in college and say, my goodness, what kind of work is this book doing? And how might these methods help me understand what it's doing, right? And the intellectual, to say nothing of the creative and affective pleasures it affords. And how can I understand these things on their own terms?
Well, there you have it. Thank you for joining us for this discussion today. I would like to especially thank Professor Kinohi Nishikawa for joining us this week. Additionally, a special thanks to Courtney Bryan for providing the music to this podcast, to the staff of the Department of African American Studies here at Princeton, our office manager, April Peters, our event coordinator, Dion Worthy, our social media specialist, Allison Bland, and our technical specialist and audio engineer, Elio Leo. Remember, you can find this podcast and more by visiting our website, aas.princeton.edu. Until next time, take care.